So, what the heck is Final Fantasy XIV? Well, depending on when you're seeing this, it's either the number one or number two top subscription based MMORPG in the world. Yeah, I decided to cover a real unknown indie gem this time. Most people will balk at the idea of a $15 per month gaming subscription, but if you're a big enough name, it's apparently still viable. That, of course, wasn't always the case for Final Fantasy XIV, though. In case you're unaware, its 1.0 launch was a disaster. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. It was so bad, Square Enix had to reboot the whole game from the ground up into something completely new, and if it hadn't worked, it would have sunk the entire company. Which is an ironic symmetry considering that's how Final Fantasy came to exist in the first place. I briefly played the 1.0, and by briefly I mean a literal hour. That's all the time it took for me to discover that the game was like Final Fantasy XI, but with prettier graphics and somehow less features. And that goes for gameplay, story, UI, UX. There wasn't a single thing Final Fantasy XIV had over 11 besides higher quality player models and skyboxes. It was not a fun game. And to fix this, they went back to the drawing board and completely remade everything. And I mean everything. The 2.0, called A Realm Reborn, kicked off by canonizing the story of 1.0 as a great calamity and having players begin again as new adventurers riding into town and having crystal-influenced dreams on the car ride. The 2.0 relaunch paid off big time. Since then, the game has had 3 expansions and has managed to dwarf its predecessor subscriber numbers. Currently, the only other MMO to compete with it in numbers is World of Warcraft. I popped in from time to time over the years, but I really dug into the game in the latest expansion, Shadowbringers. In it, they introduced 2 of my favorite jobs, the Dancer and the Gunbreaker. Because Final Fantasy VIII is the best. You see them making a soldier first-class job? Nope. Dark Knight is the big sword daddy around here, boy. Anyway, with the latest 5.3 update, they're opening up the game to be basically free to play for the first 60 levels, which covers the base game and the first expansion. So I wanted to go over some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't want to go too deep into the mechanics because as an MMO, it's got a lot of legacy stuff in there that's the usual bloat that accrues over the years, and let's be honest, it's still an MMO. The gameplay isn't exactly edge-of-your-seat stuff in the first place. This is just kind of my hot take getting started, what job to pick thoughts, and a primer on some of the lore stuff, which is a lot of trademark Final Fantasy. The story of the 1.0 release was not great, but it sets up some important things that come back later. These are the important bits. The world is called Eorzea, and its history is broken up into what are known as Astral and Umbral eras. Astral eras are the good times where everyone gets awesome robots, and the Umbral eras are the bad times when the robots turn on you and murder your family. The events of the 1.0 release were at the beginning of the 7th Umbral era. In it, the Primal Bahamut escaped from its moon prison, that is, the entire moon was made to imprison it, and basically wiped the servers. Player characters were remade in the world 5 years later and are tasked with bringing about what may be the final Astral era. So what makes the game worth playing in the 2.0? Well, they incorporated a lot stronger Final Fantasy themes in the game. It's no longer just, we have a guy named Sid, we have a chocobo, job's done, call it a day. In a lot of ways, it's actually more Final Fantasy than some of the more contemporary entries. I played Final Fantasy XI back when it launched, and it never really felt like Final Fantasy to me. If you held a gun to my head and asked me what the story of 11 was, I'd panically tell you, I don't know, I only ever got to level 30, I never found the 5 story quests. Not kidding. But if you'd ask me about 14, I'd reply with, well, which part? The Empire, because Final Fantasy, the summon monsters, the shadow body snatchers, the war with the dragons, the time travel, the crossover with Monster Hunter, the crossover with Nier, the crossover with Final Fantasy Tactics /12, or do you mean the murder mystery involving the zombie gentleman and his pyromaniac assistant? Let's go over what some of that is. Minor spoilers ahead for a lot of broad high-level stuff. The most present and obvious danger in the game is the Garlean Empire. They're your usual conquering imperial force with superior firepower and little to no ethical hang-ups. The Empire acts in opposition to the Eorzean Alliance, the 3 city-states you can begin the game in. The Eorzean Alliance citizenry all have access to powerful crystals, again, Final Fantasy, and the MacGuffin de jour energy known as Ether. Ether is how you cast spells, wield impractically large weapons, and generally do all the superhuman stuff JRPG characters can do. Garleans, however, cannot channel ether, and as such, came up with Magitech as an equalizer. Beyond simply being your usual conquering horde, though, the Garlean Empire actually does have a semi-altruistic goal in mind, and that goal is the elimination of some of the most dangerous beings in the world. Espers, summons, guardian forces, icons, primals. In Final Fantasy XIV, the usual summon monsters take on a darker twist. In this continuity, summon monsters, referred to mostly as primals by the heroes, are called forth by a combination of powerful crystals and a massive infusion of will and ether. The creature summoned takes the form, personality, and powers envisioned by the summoner or summoners. However, there's a terrible catch. The summoned creature then bends the will of all those around it to turn them into its supplicants. Only those with the power known as the Echo, i.e. plot armor, are immune to its effects. Without going too much into it, the Ascians are your standard shadowy mystery men, always in the background, just out of sight, talking cryptically about the time and that place, and how interesting the silent protagonist is. I look forward to seeing how they develop. Their goals are a mystery, and you can see their hands in just about every major event in the game. They're positioned as the overarching bad guys of the story, but they tend to lean super heavy into Xanatos gambits, and don't mind too much when you break up their plans. To say more would spoil stuff that's actively going on in current patches, so I'll just leave it at that. Those are the three main story elements to the game, but they're far from everything that's going on. You've got the conflicts in the expansions that include war with dragons, building a resistance in a foreign nation, or traveling to a parallel universe trapped in eternal corrupted sunlight to contend with. Not to mention the class quests that have their own recurring villains and support heroes by your side. Then you've got the raids, which are themselves pretty interesting and lore-relevant activities. Most of them are even themed after past Final Fantasies, or even other games. The current raid tier is themed after Final Fantasy VIII and Nier Automata, with bosses and NPCs hailing from both of those games. But a previous series was a tour de force through Final Fantasy III. It even culminated with an encounter with the Cloud of Darkness. Whew. That is a lot of Final Fantasy in this Final Fantasy game. Helping you along the way are the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. You join this group to help them curb primals and unite the city-states in the game's main storyline, and at first they're your usual MMO lore-important characters. They show up in important cutscenes to perform action set pieces so they don't have to figure out how to make a white mage character look like a cool action hero, but otherwise are completely disposable and don't help you any actual gameplay. As the game goes on, and as the tech they use got better, they started to actually do stuff and even join you sometimes in missions. Beyond gameplay, though, they each have their own stories and relationships that are what you expect from your companions from a full-blown Final Fantasy game. As usual, my favorite is the girl with super strength that punches everything. Now let's talk gameplay. Like I said before, if you want me to like your game, there are two things that you can put in it: time travel and a job system. I won't comment on how the former is in the game, but let's talk about the latter. For your tanks, you've got Paladin, Warrior, Dark Knight, Gunbreaker. Yeah, I think it's weird they put Squall's class as a tank, but yeah, whatever. Healers are Scholar, White Mage, and Astrologian. I don't play these much. DPS comes in three basic flavors. You got your melees with Dragoon, Monk, Samurai, and Ninja. Range damage is up to the Bards, Machinists, and Dancers. Yeah, I would have put Dancer as a magic support, but again, whatever. And your magic damage is dealt by the Black Mage, the Red Mage, the Summoner, and... you know what? Let's not talk about that fourth one. It's a sad story. For your character, you can be any one of the 17 combat-oriented jobs in the game, or you can be one of the 11 crafting-related jobs. And I mean at any time. By changing your weapon, you change to a different job. Put on a sword and shield, you're a paladin. Swap the sword for a magic wand, you're a black mage. Swap both for a gunblade, you're gunbreaking. Tired of punching dudes? Swap your weapons to a needle and thread to become a weaver and make some clothes. Or if you don't want to make something, pick up a pickaxe and become a miner. Some of the combat jobs are locked behind level gates or expansion-related content. For the free-to-play restrictions, you'll be able to unlock everything except for the Gunbreaker, Red Mage, Dancer, and Samurai. The awesome part of this is that you can have one character that can do every job in the game. You don't have to swap out to your other characters just to change from healing to DPS and redo all of the same content. The drawback, however, is that each class in turn has its own XP, and while you can use the things you've unlocked on higher level jobs to make things easier, realistically, swapping jobs is like rolling an alt that can't look different from your current character. The other issue is tied to the quest system. You can only do the bulk of the quests in the game once, so if you run a quest as a red mage, that's it. You'll have to find another one for XP if you want to quest as a monk later. Their fix for this issue is okay, but not great, but more on that later. The crafting related jobs are broken into 8 crafters and 3 gatherers. Gatherers include miners, fishers, and botanists, though mining and botany are functionally the same, with only difference being if you're aiming at rocks or trees. The crafting jobs are armorers, blacksmiths, carpenters, goldsmiths, leatherworkers, weavers, culinarians, and alchemists, the one plot-relevant crafting job. The crafting jobs are mostly identical for gameplay, with the only difference being the ingredients and equipment. The interesting thing is that, unlike most MMOs I've played, crafting and gathering is actually an active gameplay loop instead of a passive one. Not only are you finding the trees to harvest as a botanist, but once you're there, you have to decide how you're going to go about gathering the wood. You use abilities to increase yield or rarity, gamble on how much you'll get, or increase your chances of finding hidden items. For crafting, there's much the same. You don't just click to make the thing and wait. You play a minigame where you balance the item quality against durability to make the best version you can. And there's also a class story for each of them. Yep, you can have a chef that has to cook just the right dish to impress the food critic to save the restaurant before it gets torn down for that strip mall. I'm not kidding. Now let's get to the brass tacks. There's a lot of deep dive videos out there on what it's like to play all the different jobs in Final Fantasy XIV, but you're here for my particular flavor of bias. But before we get into that, I will just say that the game as a whole is remarkably balanced. Every class can clear any content for its given role with relatively little in the way of imbalance between them. If you're starting fresh, you'll choose a starting base class, and then that will eventually mature into the more well-known version of that class at level 30. Got it? Good. Now, on to why Rogue sucks the worst. We begin with the tanks. Paladins start off life as gladiators. They use a sword and shield and are the most stereotypical tank of the tank classes. Their armor is the most bleh when it comes to design, but they've got the most versatility with spells and physical abilities. Play them if you want to simultaneously be the party frontline and the backup. Warriors start off as Marauder. They use a big two-handed axe and feel that the best defense is a big health pool and lots of lifesteal. I'll be honest and say I haven't played this class that much, but in combat they seem to be one of the most unkillable tanks out there, so they're doing something right. Play this class if you drew the short straw in your 4-man dungeon group and you had to play a tank instead of DPS. Dark Knight is a class unlocked by the Heavensward expansion. It's super grim dark and has the best armor. They used to be a more typical Final Fantasy Dark Knight with a lot of self-harming attacks, but those days are long gone. Now they're more into damage mitigation and buff through heavy metal-inspired spells and abilities. Play one of these if you want to wade into combat and bathe in the digital blood of your enemies. Right up until they overwhelm your shields and faceplant you. Gunbreaker is unlocked by the latest expansion, Shadowbringers. It's Squall. Play this class if you can. Now let's talk about healers. White Mage starts off as a Conjurer, the only starting healer class in the game, and they have heals for days and the coolest AoE damage for a healer, Holy. They have so many heals, in fact, they're the class with the most abilities that get retired by higher level abilities later on. Play them if you want to be the most healer whoever healed while healing. Scholar starts off as the Arcanist, a DPS job. Scholar is the pet-based healing class in the game. Your pet will do some heals while you give out the shields. Their armor is the worst and makes me want to beat them up while screaming, "Nerd!" The best feature of this job is that it shares levels with Summoner. You can level one by leveling the other. Play them if you like healing, but don't want to be too focused on it. Astrologian is unlocked with Heavensward. It's based on healing and buffs through card reading. You increase your party's power by dealing cards to the correct roll and getting streaks. I have the least amount of time and experience with this job, mostly because every time I try to learn it, I get bored with the explanation partway through. Play them if you want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! While healing. Now we're in melee DPS land. Monks start out as pugilists, and they punch things really hard until they fall over. They rely on positioning to get the most out of all their moves. Pro tip, the back of your target is the open part of the circle on the ground. The front is pretty much just the front of the model, and the sides are extremely generous. Monks rely on keeping their combat flowing to keep their buffs up. Play them if you want to DPS while dancing, and don't mind a late blooming class. Dragoons start off as Lancer. They spear things by channeling dragon spirits, and they have the most static skill rotation in the game. But they eventually bring good party buffs to the table. Their armor is second only to Dark Knight in terms of design, and they jump into, out of, and next to combat at will. Play them if you want to be the one class in the game with an NPC story representative that's still actually more powerful than you. Ninja starts out as Rogue, the worst class. Want to backstab everything? Play a WoW Rogue. This one has a super long skill on cooldown that lets you backstab once every 3 combats or so. All classes get better when they mature at 30, but Ninja might as well be something completely different as far as I'm concerned, because Ninja is great. They cast mudras, a sequence of hand signals that determine the spell-like effects, and they kick butt. Play them if you want to play one of the not annoying characters from Naruto, and you can get a friend to help you power through 30 levels of mediocrity. Samurai is unlocked with the Stormblood expansion. They are the greedy melee DPS. Their contribution to the party is doing lots of damage to kill bosses quicker. Everything they do will have you saying, I remember that samurai movie. Play this class if you want to say, that's a samurai, all right. Range DPS, represent! Bard begins life as the Archer. You can tell they struggled to find a place for this class in the past because you have a handful of team buffs, but also some pretty decent range damage, and pretty much every patch has some sort of adjustment to the amount of damage that bards are able to do. They're fairly dependent on ability procs in order to get their maximum effort out, though. Play them if you want to play DPS on the move. The Machinist is unlocked with Heavensward. They're the gun class. Their key feature is an almost complete control over their damage and critical hit numbers. They also summon mechs to punch dudes and use lots of one-off tools, such as drills, poison blasters, crossbows, flamethrowers, that sort of thing. Play them if you want to be the man with no name, or Edgar from Final Fantasy VI. Dancer is unlocked with Shadowbringers. They're the best class for range support. They pick a dance partner and share their buffs and heals with that player. Their attacks are gated behind procs, and they're really good at playing into the whole dance improv theme throughout the entire thing. Play this class if you want to DPS while literally dancing. Now let's talk about magic. Black Mage starts life as the Thaumaturge, and along with Dark Knight has my favorite class questline theme, Forbidden Power. Black Mage is the explode it till it dies job. Their central mechanic is using fire spells to deal damage until they're low on MP, then using ice spells to cool off and restore it. Play them if you want to play the highest DPS class and hide your face with your hat. Summoner, like Scholar, starts out as the Arcanist. Summoners fight using simulacra of primals you fought in the main story. You might compare them to your usual pet classes, but I feel they have more deterministic control over their DPS. Plus, higher levels you start channeling Big Daddy Bahamut to drop meteors on the field. Play them if you like pet classes and don't mind getting a healer job level at the same time. Red Mage is unlocked with Stormblood, and it's my favorite caster. Red Mage in this Final Fantasy involves casting white and black magic, in this case wind and lightning respectively, in equal measure to unlock powerful melee combination attacks. They have access to some emergency healing and resurrection that makes them desired for backup in raids. Play them if you want to look classy while exploding fools. So now that you got your job picked out, let's talk about what you're going to want to do with it. First thing I want to say is this. Despite being an MMO, Final Fantasy XIV is mostly a single-player experience. Yeah, that's very annoying for a title with a subscription fee, but there you go. All of the main content in the game is written from the perspective of the singular Warrior of Light. That's you. And it's not really balanced for more than one player. You need groups for dungeons, world events, raids, and trials, but those are framed as you finding a bunch of random strangers to follow you for your super awesome adventure. Sometimes your party members are even canonical warriors of light from other dimensions called in to help you. The main thing you're going to want to do is talk to any NPC with this icon above their head. This icon means that the quest associated with this NPC will be part of the main storyline. This is where most of your XP will come from. Secondly, talk to any NPC with this icon, as the quest will unlock game content. It unlocks things like your chocobo, the hairstylist, additional dungeons, more jobs, and just a whole bunch of other neat stuff. Just when you see this icon, talk to them. This icon is a one-time side quest. They are 99% unimportant wastes of time. They are not related to the main story, their rewards are pathetic, and most of the worst kind of MMO quest. Go here, kill X of this for Y drops that are of Z rarity. Thanks, goodbye forever. Doing the main storyline quest should keep you in enough XP to complete the game anyway. Along with the main story quest, you'll want to do your class quest line as well. These are story quests that unlock your class abilities as you level up. They show up every 5 levels or so, and you'll often need what they unlock in order to do your job properly. Dungeons will start unlocking at level 15 or so if you're playing with friends. Now is when you want to start teaming up with them. Like most MMOs, dungeons have tanks, heals, and 2 DPS. You can walk into the dungeon from the world if you've got a full party, or you can matchmake in the Dungeon Finder. DPS queue time in the Dungeon Finder is, of course, a nightmare. Tanks are quick, and healers barely have a chance to even click the button before they're already matched up. If you find yourself in an XP rut between story quests, you have a few options to help you out. The most recommended is dungeon grinding. Just queue up for the highest dungeon you can do and run it to gain the levels you need. This is typically around 1 or 2 runs at most. For DPS, the current wisdom is to actually queue up while running public events called Fates of the appropriate level to kill time. The less recommendable option is deep dungeons. These are special randomly generated dungeons put into the game to help level alt jobs once you run out of quests to do. They're great for several reasons. They have a separate gearing system that makes sure that you're always at the right stat allocation to complete the content. They don't have required party makeup, so queue times are always good for everyone. They boost you to max level of the content, so you can actually use it to try out how a class plays in later levels without ruining a dungeon group's fun. The downsides, however, make it hard to recommend. It's repetitive, you only get XP at the end of every 10 floors, so if you wipe before then, you wasted all of your time. It's repetitive, it's lacking any real challenge because, again, any group composition can complete it. So if you have a group of 4 healers, they can still complete it just as well as 4 tanks or 4 DPS. It's repetitive, and it's not really got a good challenge to it, so you don't know how your class is going to perform in real-world situations. And worst of all, it's repetitive. Your alt jobs of lower level get an XP bonus that makes this at least somewhat worth doing, but without the boost, avoid this like the plague. Now I'm just going to shotgun out a couple of quick tips that I found useful for the game. Use this setting to turn down the effects in the game. There's a lot of visual noise in this game, and when you're learning what your abilities are, it is super not helpful to see everything that everyone else is doing at the same time. On your graphics, try to go for resolution and frames per second over anything else. The cursor in this game kinda sucks otherwise. You can play with a controller. It's interesting, but I am not a fan. There are healers that swear by a PS4 configuration, but I just don't see it. If you're just sticking around for the trial, I wouldn't go too deep into the crafting jobs. Once you reach the first expansion, you can access a power leveling method that takes you from 20 to 80 on those in less than a day. And it makes pretty much all of the content for them obsolete. All food gives you a 3% XP bonus. Try to be well fed at all times, because it adds up. The game has a transmog system called Glamours. It's an interesting take. The main issue I have with it is that they use an in-game consumable item that you have to keep in stock in order to keep capturing the images of the pieces of armor. I mean, it's great that you can tie a particular look to your job so you can always look how you want, but it's tiring to have to keep up with it sometimes. Most jobs share armor with the same role, but not weapons. So if you're doing multiple classes that fulfill the same role, hold on to your armor so that when you upgrade, you don't just have to keep on buying and finding it on lower level jobs. All tanks, healers, magic DPS, and range DPS use the same armor across jobs. Samurai and monk use the same armor, while ninja and dragoon actually use unique armor sets. Like all MMOs, you want to turn off general chat immediately. There's a lot of built-in UI options that can let you exert a ton of control over how your screen looks. Speaking of which, don't be intimidated by my UI. I put a lot of extra stuff on it because it makes sense to me. You can change your first job pretty early on. You just have to pick up the unlock quest from the guild hall or the halls you want. So if you accidentally picked a rogue, don't worry. You can fix it at level 10. Once you get your war chocobo, try to keep him up as much as you can. When you're going solo, he provides you with some much needed tanking, healing, and DPS. There's lots more in this game to discover, but I'm going to leave that up to you. See you in 5.3.